Hey Pike Panthers, it's me, Mr. Little again, and today I'm going to give you an oral lecture on moon phases. Now this silly looking board is something that you would have actually used had we been in class. I know it looks ridiculous, and it is, but it does a really good job of explaining the moon phases. So we're going to go through that today, step by step. I'll tell you how to figure everything out. We'll touch on a little bit of tides and how they are represented by the moon as well. And that should get you going for this week's Week 3 remote learning. Okay, so here we go. Hopefully you all can see this. I'm hoping that my technology is going to cooperate with me today. I tried this a little bit earlier and it wasn't really doing what it was supposed to, so hopefully, fingers crossed, let's hope that it works out correctly this time. So again, we're going to start with the moon phases. That is our topic for the next couple weeks. So hang in there, kids. Make sure you pay attention. I'm going to give you lots of good information to help you navigate your way through this very important concept. Okay, first thing that we need to do is establish that there are 8 phases to the moon. If I look at my silly board right here, and I know I'm kind of down here in the corner, and I look at it here, you can see I've got my sun, but then if I pan out, you can see that there are 8 moon phases. We're going to look at every single one of those and how they are represented. Obviously, with a new moon, that's when you look up in the night sky and you can just barely see the circular moon. But it's pretty much dark. You can't see very much of it. You can see that it's there a lot of times, but for the most part, there is no light. Now, before we go any further, it's very important for you kids to understand that I am seeing the moon as a result of reflected light from the sun. The moon does not emanate any type of light. It doesn't have its own light source. So any light that we are seeing as we look up at the moon is reflected from the sun to the moon and then to our eyes here on Earth. So make sure that you understand that there are some kids that actually do believe that the moon has its own light source, and that would be incorrect. So the first phase that we always start with is the new moon, pretty much because it's the easiest, and you'll see when I help you with the mnemonic that it makes the most sense. So the new moon is completely shaded in. Okay, I'm going to move to the next phase. Okay, but before I do, there's something that we need to get our minds wrapped around, okay? And it's this saying. You would have heard me say this probably no less than 2 or 3 dozen times had we been in the classroom. And it says, if the light is on the right, it's getting bright. And that's really, really important when we're trying to distinguish our moon phases. So I'll walk you through what I mean by that saying. So I'm going to skip to the next slide here, and you can see here, I've got a waxing crescent. Before we had a new moon, and it was completely dark. No part of the disk was visible for the most part. Now here, the waxing crescent, we have a large proportion of it that is shaded still dark. But we have over here a lighted portion. Oops, let's go back. We have a lighted portion, kind of almost looks like a fingernail, if you will. Just a very small proportion of the moon is illuminated. And as long as you know your left from your right, then you would know by the saying that I'm going to go through again, if the light is on the right, it's getting bright. So in this case, the light is on the right. I'm starting to grow my light. That's what waxing means. Waxing means that the proportion of the Earth's surface, or the moon's surface, excuse me, is going to become more and more illuminated. Right now, it looks like a crescent, which is right here, and it is starting its waxing phase, so it is starting to grow. Okay, next slide. We can see we've got a first quarter. Okay, in the first quarter, you can see half of the moon is illuminated. It's still, the light is on the right, it's getting bright. So you can see that the proportion of the moon is becoming more and more illuminated. Now, from our perspective on Earth, we can see that roughly half of the face of the moon is lighted while the other half is still in darkness. Now, here it's really important to understand that if I were outside of Earth's orbit, and looking down at the sun and the earth, I would see that half of the moon is always illuminated. 50% of a sphere is always going to be illuminated. The reason that we don't see that on Earth is simply because of our perspective. When we're on Earth, we see certain proportions of the moon being illuminated. But if we were out in space, 50% of the moon is always illuminated. So here, from our perspective, we can see roughly half of the face is being illuminated. So if I go on to the next slide, you should now see, based upon the premise that if the light is on the right, it's getting bright, we're going to see a larger proportion of the moon's face being illuminated. And that's what we see here with a waxing gibbous. You can see here 75 to 80% of the surface or the face is illuminated, while this proportion over here is still in darkness. I'm still growing, so I'm still waxing, and gibbous just simply means that I have a large proportion illuminated. So here again, I can see that it is growing. And again, I want to point out a very important fact here as well, kids, that when I'm looking at moon phases, it's a natural progression. So each day, I'm illuminating that moon surface a little bit. It doesn't just jump from waxing crescent to first quarter to waxing gibbous, right? We should understand that the moon's illumination is growing throughout. So every day it's getting a little bit more illuminated until I finally get to a full moon. And that's when I can look up in the night sky and I can see that the full face of the moon is illuminated. So here it's 50%, right, from space, but it's 100% from our perspective here on Earth. Okay, now we're going to start to cycle back. Okay, now take a look at this next picture, and you can see here what's called a waning gibbous. Two things to point out. Waning means to lessen. It means to basically, the illuminated portion is going to start to decrease now. Gibbous, I still have a large proportion of illuminated, but here's where it's important. Is the light on the right? No, the light is now on the left side of the moon, right? So now I'm not getting brighter, I'm starting to get dimmer. I'm starting to decrease the amount of light that I see illuminated or reflected on the moon's surface. So again, it's about 80%, but now it's on the left side instead of the right side. Okay, next phase, we've got the third quarter. Now my proportion is down to about 50% of the face, right? I can see the left side is illuminated and the right side is still in shadow or darkness. And then finally, by the time I get to the last phase, if you've been paying attention, now I've got a very small proportion of illuminated surface and it's on the left side. So again, it follows the premise that if the light is on the right, it's getting bright. In this case, after full moon phase, I go from waning gibbous to third quarter to waning crescent, and the amount of illumination is decreasing as I go through. So here, again, I've got about 75 to 80% of the moon that's in shadow or darkness, and about 20 to 25% that's still being illuminated. Finally, I work my way back to new moon, and I start the process all over again. So those are the 8 phases of the moon. We begin with new moon, then we go on to waxing crescent, and then the next one is first quarter phase, and then the next one is going to be waxing gibbous. We get to full moon, and now we're going to start to shrink our illumination. Now we've got waning gibbous, third quarter, and waning crescent. Okay, so those 8 moon phases are really, really important. Now I'm going to try to help you as best I can here. We're going to show you a couple models that's going to help you really kind of get that to sink in. And we're going to use a mnemonic called SNEF. You may be asking, well, what does SNEF mean? I'm glad you asked because I'm about to show you. Okay, if I take a look at this model right here, I can see the sun, and then I put Earth right here in the middle, and I've got the new moon and the full moon, and notice how they make a line across. So if I were to write it out, S-N-E-F. So my new moon is always between the Earth and the sun. So when we're trying to figure out our moon phases, the first thing we need to establish is, where is my new moon? Easiest way to figure out as a new moon is, where's the sun? Because it goes sun, then new moon, then Earth, then full moon, all in a straight line. And if I go ahead and put the sun over, see how it's on the left-hand side here? If I flip it so now the sun is on the right side, it still spells S-N-E-F. We still have the same positions, the new moon, then the Earth, then the full moon. And we work our way counterclockwise around. Never clockwise, always counterclockwise. So we're going to go from here, circle around here to full moon, and then work our way back to the new moon. Okay, this is the part where you may want to pause the video and draw this. This is probably among 2 slides, the most important one that you can draw. This is, if I were in space and looking down, this is really what it would basically be from our perspective on Earth, excuse me, not from space, because from space, it would show basically all of this 50% being illuminated. So even though this isn't a real picture from space, I misspoke there, this is what we see from our perspective here on Earth. And I should have gone ahead and shaded that, but that is my mistake right there. That should be completely shaded, and then that should be completely visible. So you can see here I'm working my way in a counterclockwise direction. I've got waxing crescent, first quarter, waxing gibbous. Notice that for these three phases, what's happening if the light is on the right, it's getting bright. Okay, so my light is growing with each phase until I get to the full moon, and then I start to decrease the amount of light. See here I've got my waning gibbous, my third quarter, and my waning crescent, and then back to the new moon. And darn it, I really wish that I had shaded that in. You will have to do that on your end, okay, because that may be a little bit confusing. Here's another model of it, though. This one, again, shows the progression of it. There are certain reasons why I like this, why I don't like it. I'm not really going to get into it because I've only got about 4 minutes left of this recording. But you can see here it follows the same thing. Waxing crescent, first quarter, waxing gibbous, full moon, waning gibbous, third quarter, and waning crescent. Okay. Next thing we need to know is our calendar. The lunar cycle lasts about 29.5 days. Every phase is about 3.5 days. So if I go from here, and let's say it is April 1st here, then on or about April 4th, I'm going to experience a waxing crescent. On or about the 7th of April, I'm going to go ahead and experience a first quarter. So each phase covers roughly 3.5 days. What I did here was I divided it into 4 quadrants to make it a little bit easier. So every 2 phases, you can see here, I've got 7 days. So if this was April 1st, this would be April 8th. And then by the time I get over here to the full moon phase, it's April 15th, because 7, right here, 7 days, plus 7 days gives me 14. And if I start on the 1st, that would give me the 15th. So one of the things that you're going to have to accomplish in your quiz and check for understanding are calendars. If I go ahead and establish, let's say that April 15th, I get a full moon, when would I get a new moon? Well, if I do my counting correctly, and I say, well, I've got 7 days plus 7 days, that's going to give me 14 days, then I would say that I would get a new moon on or about approximately April 29th, right? Because April 15th plus 14 days is going to give me April 29th. Okay, it may switch it around a little bit. It may give you the dates instead and say, okay, now you got to tell me what phase is occurring. Well, if April 7th, I have a first quarter moon, on April 28th, what phase am I experiencing? Well, if I do my counts and I say, okay, well, I've got April 7th here and I count 7 days, that's April 14th. I go here is April 21st. And I go here's April 28th. Oh, well, I experience a new moon. Okay, so they can be a little bit tricky. Just be careful of that. Every 2 phases is about 7 days. We use 28 days because who wants to work with a number like 29.5 days? Having a prime number like that would be really difficult to work out mathematically. So that's why we go and change it to 28 days. It just makes it easier for kids to kind of understand when you can base every 2 phases off of 7 days. Okay, next thing we need to look at, and I've only got about a minute and a half to cover this part here, is tides. Tides are the result of the moon and the sun's gravitational attraction with us. So I can see on the low tide, it's sitting on the beach. All my fish, they haven't been able to make it out. So they're sitting on the beach, they're dead. And it could be happening during the day or at night. It really doesn't matter. What you do need to understand is that it is 12 hours apart. So if I get a low tide at 6 a.m., the next low tide I'm going to experience is going to be around 6 p.m. because they occur twice a day. My high tides are also going to be 2 times a day, and in this case it could be 12 o'clock midnight and 12 o'clock noon. And notice that because of the moon and the sun's gravitational attraction, it's pulling that water outward. It's making that water rise. Now you might be asking, well, why is that? If I look at tides, since we experience them basically 4 times a day, depending on 2 high tides and 2 low tides, I actually get something called a spring and a neap tide 4 times a month. 2 spring tides and 2 neap tides. The spring tides form a straight line, and they occur during our new moon phase and our full moon phase. Our neap tide occurs during our first quarter and our third quarter moon phase because it's almost like they're making a right angle instead of straight across. so they're kind of fighting with each other. And I have run out of time, kids, so that is our